My name is Richard Caldwell. I am 48 years old, and until about 3 weeks ago, I served as a senior infrastructure architect at a logistics technology company known as OmniLogics Supply Solutions. I had dedicated 24 years of my life to this company, pouring my sweat, tears, and intellectual property into building a $95 million orchestration system from the ground up. This system was the absolute lifeblood of our organization. It was an incredibly complex beast that handled everything from high-volume order routing to precision warehouse coordination across 47 distribution centers nationwide. Every single day, millions of transactions flowed through my architecture, and for 24 years I kept it running smoothly. I was the silent guardian, the invisible hand that prevented catastrophic failures before anyone even knew they were possible. To save costs, she decided to cut my overtime. She did not ask me to reduce it. She did not request that I scale back my hours. She cut it entirely, completely, and without any room for negotiation or discussion. The system will be fine, my boss insisted, standing at the absolute front of the expansive, glass-walled budget review room. She was pointing a laser at a sprawling PowerPoint slide that had my name explicitly highlighted in a glaring, accusatory shade of red. Next to my name, in bold, capitalized letters, were the words, Legacy, Rizandra Optimization. Her name was Victoria Larson. She was 36 years old, possessed a Harvard MBA, and had spent 3 years in management consulting before parachuting into OmniLogics as our new director of engineering operations. She was impeccably dressed, highly organized, and spoke fluently in the modern corporate lexicon of OKRs, quarterly reviews, and cost per transaction metrics. However, she was also completely and utterly disconnected from the actual reality of how our technological infrastructure functioned. She had never deployed a single line of code in her life. She had never been forced to debug a critical production issue at 3 in the morning. She had never felt the ice-cold dread of an alert screaming that the primary transaction log was full and the entire system was a mere 4 minutes away from a complete and total halt. To Victoria, the platform was nothing more than a black box with inputs and outputs. As long as the financial metrics looked appealing on her spreadsheets, she assumed the system was healthy. I was sitting exactly 3 seats down the long mahogany conference table, my hands folded neatly in front of me, forcing myself to maintain a calm and professional demeanor as I watched her present my life's work as nothing more than a simple expense problem that could be neatly solved with a rigid policy memo. Behind her, the high-definition projector displayed a bar chart detailing my overtime hours over the last 4 quarters. Each bar was progressively higher than the last, colored in that same accusatory red, as if I had committed some kind of egregious fraud by choosing to keep the company's most critical infrastructure alive outside of standard business hours. It was as if I was doing something morally wrong by caring about whether our clients' orders actually got processed, or whether their warehouses went completely dark in the middle of the night. We are implementing a strict business hours only support model for all non-emergency systems. Victoria continued smoothly, clicking her presentation remote to transition to the next slide. Effective immediately, Richard will no longer be authorized for any after-hours work unless it is explicitly scheduled through the formal on-call rotation. I felt the eyes of every single executive in the room immediately land on me, only to quickly dart away in discomfort. The finance director nodded approvingly, looking as though Victoria had just discovered the cure for the common cold. The HR representative smiled a vacant corporate smile, acting as though this was some massive victory for work-life balance. The operations director simply stared down at his sleek laptop, pretending to take detailed notes to avoid making eye contact with me. Absolutely nobody asked the painfully obvious question that was screaming inside my head. What exactly happens when the system inevitably breaks at midnight? I slowly raised my hand, ensuring that my voice remained perfectly calm and measured. Just to clarify, I said, my tone devoid of emotion, you are officially telling me not to monitor system health, and not to respond to any critical issues outside of standard business hours, even if I see critical alerts. Even if I know with absolute certainty that it is going to cascade into a full, unrecoverable system outage. Victoria looked at me with a mixture of annoyance and condescension, as if I was a stubborn child refusing to understand a simple instruction. "That is correct, Richard," she stated firmly. "We simply cannot justify paying premium overtime rates for a system that has been perfectly stable for months. If something happens after hours, it either waits until the morning or it goes through the general on-call engineering team. The general on-call team does not possess production access," I countered immediately. "Then we will grant it to them," she replied smoothly, dismissing my concern with a wave of her hand. "They do not know the architecture." I pressed further. "This is a $95 million system with thousands of undocumented microdependencies." "Then we will train them," she said, her voice tightening slightly. "That takes months of dedicated training." I stated factually, her perfectly practiced corporate smile tightened into a thin, unyielding line. "Richard, I appreciate your institutional knowledge, I really do. But we cannot continue to build operational models around legacy resources being available 24/7. It is not scalable, it is not sustainable, and frankly, it is not modern." Legacy resources. That was exactly what she called me. 24 years of dedicated experience, 24 years of holding this fragile company together with my bare hands, and I was casually dismissed as a legacy resource. Like I was some outdated piece of hardware that needed to be quietly phased out and sent to the scrap heap. She turned her attention back to the massive screen, completely dismissing me without uttering another word. I did not argue. I did not raise my voice. I simply made a mental note of the exact time, 2:47 p.m. on a Tuesday afternoon. And I decided right then and there that I would follow her new directive to the absolute letter. There would be no more late-night system check-ins. There would be no more weekend database patches. There would be no more silent saves that protected the company's bottom line. If she truly wanted to see what fine looked like without my constant vigilance, I was going to show her. That evening, I sat down at my desk and meticulously drafted an email. It was perfectly professional, exhaustively detailed, and entirely unemotional. The subject line read, "After-hours support model and system risk documentation." I thoroughly explained the platform's intricate architecture, the fragile dependencies, the inevitable failure modes, and the undeniable fact that I was the only engineer within the entire organization who possessed full production access and deep, comprehensive knowledge of the entire technology stack across 3 major generational iterations. I meticulously listed the specific scenarios that required immediate, expert response. I detailed the queue saturation risks. When message queues filled past 85% capacity, the system would immediately start dropping critical client orders. Recovery from this required manual queue rebalancing and highly selective message purging. The time to full system failure in this scenario was just 15 to 30 minutes. I documented the database log overflow risks. If transaction logs were not regularly and manually truncated, the database would completely halt all write operations. Recovery required complex log backups and incredibly careful transaction replays. The time to full system failure was 45 to 90 minutes. I explained the carrier API timeout risks and the cascading backlogs they created. I then provided a detailed financial estimate of the cost of a full overnight outage. Based on historical data, I calculated $28 million in delayed shipments, SLA penalties, and potential contract breaches. Furthermore, I specifically referenced California legal statutes, noting that willful negligence in maintaining critical infrastructure could potentially expose the company to claims of breach of fiduciary duty, and that the resulting financial damages could trigger severe consequences. Then, I wrote the single paragraph that would matter most when this inevitable disaster finally ended up in front of the board of directors. Per today's explicit directive from the Director of Engineering Operations, I will no longer monitor system health or respond to any alerts outside of standard business hours 8 a.m. to 5 p.m. PST, unless I am formally scheduled and compensated as on-call. Any and all after-hours incidents will be handled exclusively by the designated on-call engineer or deferred until the next standard business day. This policy changed significantly and unavoidably increases the risk of extended, catastrophic outages during high-impact hours. I CC'd Victoria, the head of HR, the operations director, the VP of engineering, and Daniel Vance, our CTO. I attached a copy of the current on-call rotation schedule, which glaringly did not include a single person with my level of access, and a summary of the extensive training requirements for a viable backup engineer. I clicked send at exactly 6:47 p. Victoria replied exactly 5 minutes later. Thanks for the documentation, Richard. Understood. We will proceed as planned. The VP of engineering replied shortly after, noting that we would discuss backup training options next week. Daniel Vance, the CTO, did not reply at all. I calmly closed my laptop, walked to my car, and drove home in complete silence. For the first time in 24 years, I did not bring my work laptop home with me. I did not anxiously check the monitoring dashboards before going to bed. I just stopped, and it felt absolutely terrifying, incredibly liberating, and entirely inevitable. The new policy officially went into effect the following Monday. HR sent me a remarkably cheerful notification through the company portal, requiring me to digitally sign an updated job description. The section that used to demand 24/7 system availability through proactive monitoring now explicitly stated, support system operations during standard business hours only. Escalate after-hours issues to designated on-call engineer. I clicked acknowledge, legally binding them to their own foolishness. Then I did something I hadn't done in over 2 decades. I went home at exactly 5 p.m. every single day. I left the building without a laptop bag, without a VPN connection, and without any monitoring applications installed on my personal phone. The first few days were deceptively quiet. The system hummed along, the database logs truncated automatically, and the vendor APIs behaved. Victoria even sent a smug, department-wide email on Thursday celebrating the positive results and significant cost savings of her new support model. I read her email and said absolutely nothing. I knew something that Victoria and her MBA did not. The system wasn't stable because it was well-designed, it was stable because it was lucky. And in the world of enterprise architecture, luck always runs out. On Friday afternoon, our absolute biggest client's marketing department launched a massive surprise weekend promotion. It was a completely unannounced flash sale, 40% off everything, with free expedited shipping, valid for 48 hours only. They didn't tell us. They didn't warn anyone in operations. They just launched the campaign at 4 p.m. and promptly went home for the weekend by 6 p.m. Our order volume was up 340% from the previous Friday. I saw the terrifying spike in the dashboard just before I left the office. The queues were climbing rapidly, API response times were slowing to a crawl, and the database transaction rate was completely spiking. It wasn't critical yet, but it was trending toward a catastrophic failure at breakneck speed. Under the old model, I would have stayed late, adjusted the queue thresholds, preemptively scaled up our batch processing, and monitored the vendor API health throughout the entire night. Under the new model, however, I simply shut down my workstation at exactly 5:02 p.m. and walked out of the building. I went home, cooked a nice dinner, and spent the evening watching a movie with my ex-wife, Sarah. We still got together for dinner occasionally, especially when our kids were visiting. My daughter Jessica was home from nursing school, and my son Matthew had driven down from college. It was incredibly nice to sit around the table, talking about normal things, entirely disconnected from the digital time bomb that was silently ticking away in the company server room. At 9:30 p.m., I went to bed completely unreachable and entirely at peace. I did not know that at exactly 10:15 p.m. that night, the very first critical alert triggered on the monitoring dashboard. The automated system desperately screamed its warning. Message queal dep at 87% sats. That critical alert went directly to Julian Brooks, a junior developer who had shadowed me exactly once for half a day. Nearly 6 months ago, Julian saw the bright red alert on his screen, immediately panicked, and desperately tried to log into the production platform to assess the situation. Access denied. He frantically tried connecting through the Secure Operations VPN. Access denied. He simply did not have the necessary production credentials. Nobody had updated his security permissions because Victoria and her management team hadn't thought that far ahead. Julian called the operations director. There was no answer. It was Friday night. He called Victoria. It went straight to voicemail. He called the VP of Engineering. Voicemail. At 10:42 p.m., the internal queue hit 94% capacity, and the system began mercilessly dropping messages. Critical client orders simply disappeared, vanishing completely and silently into the digital void. Julian didn't know how to check the message dead letter queues. He didn't know which specific diagnostic logs to read. He had absolutely no idea that this queue saturation would inevitably trigger a catastrophic cascade that would bring down everything I had built. At 10:58 p.m., a vital warehouse inventory synchronization job failed and entered into an infinite recursive retry loop. At 11:17 p.m., the central database ran entirely out of transaction log space and immediately halted all write operations. Every single subsystem that attempted to write data, order processing, inventory updates, shipment tracking, carrier integration, froze instantly. The entire platform violently stopped. $95 million worth of advanced supply chain orchestration was dead in the water. Julian stared at his glowing monitors, watching hundreds of red alerts multiply like a virulent disease spreading through a body, and he did the only thing he could think of. He called me. My phone was off. He called again. No answer. He called 5 more times in a state of absolute desperation, getting nothing but my standard voicemail greeting. At 11:34 p.m., he sent an all-caps email to the entire engineering leadership chain with the subject line, "Urgent, platform down. Need Richard immediately." At 11:41 p.m., someone from the client's executive operations team called OmniLogic's emergency escalation line. "Your system just went completely dark," they screamed, the panic evident in their voice. "We have 14,000 high-priority orders stuck in limbo. Our warehouses are showing absolute zero inventory. What the hell is happening over there?" At 11:58 p.m., the VP of Engineering finally saw Julian's frantic emails and called him back. "Where is Richard?" he demanded. "I can't reach him," Julian said, his voice literally shaking. "I've called him 7 times. His phone goes straight to voicemail. Keep trying," the VP barked. "I am escalating this directly to the CTO." At 12:14 a.m., Daniel Vance, our CTO, a man who normally never, ever touched ground-level operations because he trusted engineers like me to handle it, joined an emergency Zoom call. Also on the call were Julian, the VP, Victoria, and 3 extremely angry warehouse operations managers from the client who had been unceremoniously dragged out of bed. "Status?" Daniel asked sharply. His tie loosened, looking as though he had thrown on the very first shirt he could find in the dark. "The platform is completely down," Julian stammered. "I can't access production. I don't know how to restart the critical jobs. I don't even know what failed first. The alerts are just everywhere, Daniel. It's a total meltdown." Daniel turned his intense gaze to Victoria, visible on the grainy webcam despite the late hour, still dressed in business attire because she had likely been at some upscale networking event. "Where is Richard?" he demanded. "He is off call tonight," Victoria said, and I guarantee she was finally starting to feel the icy, undeniable grip of real professional terror. "Per the new support policy." Daniel's expression darkened significantly. "Get him on the phone right now." Victoria tried calling me. No answer. She tried again. Nothing. She sent a frantic text message, followed by an email. "Richard, critical outage. Need you immediately. Call me ASAP." I didn't see any of it. I was sleeping peacefully in my own bed, dreaming about entirely normal things instead of error codes and cascading system failures. By 12:47 a.m., Daniel made an executive decision. "Wake up, everyone. Get the entire infrastructure team on the line. Get the senior database administrators. Get anyone who has ever touched this platform. We are not waiting for Richard." Over the course of the next chaotic hour, 5 bleary-eyed engineers joined the emergency call. Not a single one of them had full production access. Not a single one of them knew the highly customized system well enough to accurately diagnose the root cause of the failure. They fumbled blindly through error logs, restarted random services in a panic, and desperately tried rebooting massive servers. Nothing worked. It failed because they didn't know what I knew. You couldn't just restart these services. You had to clear the saturated queues first, meticulously truncate the corrupted logs, precisely reset the sync state, and then bring the core services back online in a very specific, undocumented sequence. It was exactly like trying to perform intricate open-heart surgery using a manual you had never even read. By 2 a.m., the enraged client had escalated the issue to their executive board. By 2:30 a.m., OmniLogic's CEO, Oliver Thorne, was on the call, undoubtedly wondering how a supposedly routine cost optimization strategy had violently mutated into a company-threatening crisis of this magnitude. By 2:34 a.m., Daniel finally pulled up the high-detailed email I had sent exactly 3 weeks earlier. He read it slowly, out loud, his face completely draining of color as the horrifying reality of what they were looking at set in. The explicitly documented warnings, the accurate risk assessments, the precise timeline predictions. All of it was playing out in real time, exactly as I had warned them it would. "Victoria," Daniel said quietly, his voice carrying that incredibly dangerous, dead calm that senior executives get right before they end someone's career. "Tell me you have a backup plan." She hesitated, her voice trembling. We were going to train Julian. It was scheduled for next month. Did you grant him production access?" Daniel demanded. Absolute silence. "Did you document any of Richard's proprietary recovery procedures?" More silence. Daniel closed his eyes and exhaled slowly, like a man watching his entire professional reputation crumble into dust. "Call Richard," he ordered. "Now. Offer him absolutely whatever he wants. Just get him online." Victoria tried again. No answer. Daniel tried. No answer. By 3:11 a.m., someone actually suggested driving to my house. That is exactly when you know a situation is truly desperate, when C-suite executives are actively planning to send employees to ring doorbells in the middle of the night. But it was much worse than just a technical outage. I found out later that in a desperate bid to cover her tracks, Victoria had frantically attempted to alter the approval logs in our internal document management system. She had tried to digitally forge my signature on an addendum that supposedly stated I agreed the system was fully stable and required no after-hours maintenance. This was a clear violation of California Penal Code, Section 470, for forgery. It was a desperate, incredibly stupid move that would make the entire document void ab initio, meaning it was completely legally invalid from the very moment of its creation. Furthermore, I held the intellectual property rights to the core routing algorithm used in the platform. We had a complex licensing agreement, and by trying to forge my approval to alter the operational terms, they were actively violating 35 U.S.C. Section 271 regarding patent infringement. If I revoked their license, they wouldn't just have an outage. They wouldn't have a product at all. And it didn't stop there. Earlier that week, Victoria had aggressively tried to force out my colleague, Stephen Gallagher. Stephen was 68 years old, and she had threatened to freeze his accrued pension benefits if he didn't voluntarily retire, a blatant violation of the California Welfare and Institutions Code Section 1561030. Concerning elder financial abuse, she was also planning mass layoffs in the infrastructure department without providing the required 60-day notice, violating the Federal Warning Act. The legal liability she was creating for the company was absolutely staggering. Her actions constituted a massive breach of fiduciary duty to the company's shareholders. And it was all about to blow up in her face. At 3:30 a.m., my doorbell rang. I woke up genuinely confused and checked my phone. It was still turned off. I stumbled to the front door and looked through the peephole. It was Julian Brooks, standing in my hallway looking absolutely miserable and terrified. I opened the door in my pajamas. "Richard," he said, his voice cracking, and I could see the absolute relief wash over his pale face. "I am so sorry to wake you up. The entire platform is down. It has been down for over 4 hours. Nobody can fix it. We desperately need you." I blinked at him, feigning confusion. "I am not on call, Julian," I said calmly. "I know," he said quickly, his words tumbling out. "I know. But Victoria explicitly told everyone not to bother you unless it was formally scheduled, and Daniel is going completely crazy, and the client is actively threatening to terminate the entire contract." He stopped, took a deep breath, and delivered the final blow. "The CTO has officially authorized emergency pay, triple overtime, retroactive compensation, whatever you need. Please, Richard." I looked at him for a long, silent moment. This young engineer was standing in my hallway in the middle of the night because the people who had dismissed me as a legacy resource had just violently learned what happens when they try to operate without the legacy. "Let me get dressed," I said. I did not rush. I took my time. I made a fresh pot of good coffee. I put on actual professional clothes, not the casual hoodie I usually wore for middle-of-the-night emergencies. I took my time backing my car out of the driveway, and I drove to the corporate office at exactly the speed limit. For the first time in 24 years, I was going to fix their massive crisis strictly on my own terms. I walked into the building at exactly 4:38 a.m. The executive war room was absolute chaos. 15 people were crammed into the main conference room, laptops scattered everywhere. The massive central monitor was displaying dashboard after dashboard of critical red alerts. Empty coffee cups and energy drink cans littered the large mahogany table like debris on a battlefield. Daniel Vance saw me walk in and stood up immediately. "Richard." I nodded curtly, sat down, pulled out my laptop, and opened the secure production console for the first time in 8 days. What I saw made my stomach drop. Not because it was unexpected, but because the catastrophic damage was significantly worse than I had initially feared. The message queues were completely saturated. The massive database logs were full to the brim. Vital synchronization jobs were hopelessly stuck in fatal retry loops. The critical order backlog was sitting at 31,000 and growing by the minute. This was not going to be a quick fix. This was going to require digital archaeological reconstruction. "Status?" Daniel asked, his voice tight with anxiety. I took a slow sip of my hot coffee. The platform halted because the core database ran entirely out of transaction log space. That happened because a warehouse synchronization job went into an infinite retry loop. That happened because the primary message queues saturated and began dropping orders. And that happened because nobody adjusted the queue thresholds when the client's order volume severely spiked last night. I pulled up a detailed timeline on the big screen. The very first alert triggered at 10:15 p.m. If someone with access and proper training had responded then, this would have taken exactly 20 minutes to fix. Now, it is going to take hours. Daniel's jaw tightened visibly. "How many hours?" "7, maybe 8. And that is assuming absolutely nothing else breaks while I am executing the recovery sequence." Victoria spoke up from the back of the room, her voice unusually small and shaky. "What do you need?" I turned slowly in my chair to look at her directly. "I need everyone in this room who does not have full production access to leave immediately. I need database administrator support on standby. I need the client's operations team to stop calling every 10 minutes demanding updates. And I need you to officially authorize full maintenance mode so I can take the entire platform offline and rebuild it cleanly." Daniel didn't even hesitate. "Done. Whatever you need, Richard." I started typing. The room went completely quiet except for the rapid sound of my keyboard and the occasional whispered conversation. Step 1. Stop the bleeding. I manually disabled all inbound order processing. Step 2. Clear the catastrophic jams. I meticulously purged thousands of corrupted messages from the dead letter queues. Step 3. Recover the database. I manually triggered a massive transaction log backup, systematically truncated the log file, and strictly verified that write operations were possible again. Step 4. Reset the synchronization jobs. Step 5. Restart the core services in the exact necessary sequence. At 11:42 a.m., the very first clean order finally processed. At 12:15 p.m., the massive backlog began to steadily drain. At 1:38 p.m., all systems were glowing green. I leaned back in my chair and closed my eyes. The post-mortem meeting on Monday was brutal. The CEO, Oliver Thorne, led the inquisition. The company was facing $2.8 million in confirmed SLA penalties. The technical failure was entirely predictable. I had documented it. The operational failure was entirely Victoria's doing. I laid out my terms. First, immediate hiring and training of a backup engineer with full production access. Second, a formal on-call rotation with proper compensation. Third, my title and compensation will reflect my actual role. I want the title of VP of Engineering, Infrastructure Systems, with direct authority over operational policy. I also brought up the legal violations. the attempted forgery under Penal Code Section 470, the elder financial abuse regarding Stephen, and the patent infringement issues under 35 U.S.C. Section 271. The CEO looked at the devastating damage assessment on the screen. Done. Victoria was quietly reassigned to special projects that very afternoon and was officially terminated 2 months later. 6 months later, I had a properly trained backup, Julian, who understood that critical systems are living things. We had a real on-call rotation, proper change control, and above all, respect. When someone tells you your decades of experience are just legacy resources, get it in writing. Because eventually, they will learn, either by listening to you or by paying millions to learn the extremely hard way.